Silence all around.
Please open the commission.
The Royal Commission is now in session. Please be seated.
Yes, Mr. Rosen.
Morning, Commissioners. Commissioners, Bernard Cooney was a Victorian senator between 1984 and 2002. Barney, as he was known, died in February of this year after a long illness. At his funeral, which was attended by over 2,000 people, Mr. Cooney was lauded for his many years of public life and his great contribution to Australia, both in the law and for his time in Parliament. Speakers at the funeral, all of them, spoke of his great humanity and his devotion to his family. His last years were spent in a residential aged care facility in Melbourne. When this Royal Commission was announced in 2018, Mr. Cooney prepared a written submission which he provided to the Royal Commission. The written submission is AWF.001.00519_0001. This is what the late Mr. Cooney wrote in his submission. I applaud the announcement by Prime Minister Morrison of a Royal Commission into the aged care system and appreciate the opportunity to contribute to this extremely important process. It is entirely understandable that in view of the recent exposure of appalling incidents of non-compliance with mistreatment of residents in aged care facilities and the failure to maintain acceptable standards of care, that he said we should brace ourselves for some pretty bruising information. However, behaviours of the kind to which he was referring and have attracted publicity constitute only the most extreme manifestations of the mistreatment and deficiencies that are endemic to our system of aged care. Far more pernicious and difficult to identify are the largely unaddressed gaps in the provision of satisfactory personal support directed to the physical, emotional and psychological well-being of residents of aged care facilities. The pleasant physical surroundings and happy caring environments depicted in glossy corporate brochures in order to attract potential customers often conceal the real situation and experience of residents, particularly when they become disabled. The desire to maximise returns for shareholders is almost certainly the underlying explanation for these failures. It can be seen in minimum and often inadequate staffing levels, in the failure to ensure the adequate training and supervision of personnel, in the absence of serious endeavours to develop and conduct stimulatory programs and social interactions for residents, and in the failure to take advantage of the technological aids that are now available to assist in all of these areas. Formal compliance with poorly described and limited formal standards appears to be the objective. The practical outcome of these deficiencies is, at minimum, the development of a sense of boredom and personal irrelevance for many residents, and at most, serious physical and mental suffering for others. This is of particular importance for those who are otherwise socially isolated. There are several reasons why this unfortunate state of affairs continues, including the reluctance and apprehension of elderly and fearful residents to lodge complaints against those upon whom they are so heavily dependent. I'm a resident in an aged care facility in Victoria, unable to perform the simplest acts to assist myself or even to adjust my position in the bed-style chair to which I am confined during my waking hours. If I become uncomfortable, thirsty or hungry, I press the buzzer, which is usually, but not always, placed close to my right hand. My voice is weak, so I'm unable to call for the assistance that may not be provided for up to an hour or so. In addition to what can be significant physical discomfort, this results in great frustration. I should add that the position has improved markedly since the Commission was announced. This is highly unlikely to be a coincidence, and I doubt that I'm being too cynical in asserting that there will be a quick reversion if the pressure to comply in letter and spirit, even with the present requirements, is released. A simple example of the tick box approach to the current formal standards in the operation of the facility can be seen in the provision of morning and afternoon tea. Each day, cups of coffee are brought to my room at the appropriate time by a kitchen staff member. The cup is then placed on a trolley or small table. I cannot move my chair to reach for it, and even if I could do so, I would be unable to hold the cup or drink without assistance. It does not seem to me to be unreasonable to expect, given that my physical condition is well known to the facility's administrators, that this assistance would be automatically provided. That does not happen, and I find myself disinclined to press my buzzer for a cup of coffee, when it is difficult enough to secure a response, at times when I'm experiencing severe discomfort and require staff members to readjust my position. The coffee will usually remain on the trolley or table until the cup is removed or I am assisted to drink by a visitor. Of course, whether or not I have a morning or afternoon cup of coffee is not of itself significant. I've chosen this example as a simple means of demonstrating the embedded culture and approach that is taken by the facility operators. I make no complaint about the physical conditions of the facility, nor would it be reasonable to criticise staff members for their performance of demanding and underpaid roles, but the absence of adequate training for them and the failure of our systems for the monitoring of standards of care in settings of this kind are evident. The objectives of the regulatory framework and the expectations of the Australian community with respect to the quality of care to be provided to some of its most vulnerable members are claimed to be satisfied by what is effectively little more than formal procedural compliance, and too often this is unchallenged. In addition to attention being directed to the staffing issues already mentioned, there must be substantial improvements made to ensure that the system of performance monitoring of providers operates effectively. Standing behind that must be the likelihood of the imposition of strong sanctions where proper standards are not met. The prospect of genuine and likely accountability of providers for failure to meet such standards is vital. I'm fortunate that I do not experience the social isolation of many others, as I have a loving family and good friends to support me. I'm in a far better position than many residents to make my concerns known, but I still experience these difficulties. Even if you have them, friends and relatives cannot be present to monitor the day-to-day situation or assist with day-to-day issues. Of necessity, they must rely to some extent upon the integrity of the operators and may be hesitant about raising issues which could potentially create problems for their family member. It is apparent that residents like myself need an easily accessible and independent voice to assist them and ensure that their reasonable requests and expectations can be brought to the attention of the facility administrators and that proper standards of care are maintained. The more disabled the resident becomes, the greater is this need. I recommend that this support be provided by qualified social workers who would be in regular attendance at the facilities, as they would possess the specialist knowledge and insights required to provide appropriate support and advocacy when needed to address both physical and emotional well-being. The real values of a society, as distinct from its stated claims, can be measured by the way in which its most vulnerable members, and that certainly includes those in aged care facilities, are treated. Not much empathy is needed to appreciate that it is hard to retain a sense of personal dignity when little by little individual autonomy is lost. Viewed against that standard, our failures are apparent. And Mr Cooney agreed to the submission being made public under his name. Commissioners, that brings us to the last witness that we intend to call as part of the Perth hearings. That witness is Dr Lisa Trigg, and I call her to the witness stand.
Yes. I solemnly and sincerely
I solemnly and sincerely
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
will be the truth,
will be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Morning, Dr. Trigg.
Morning.
Could you state for the transcript your full name, please?
Lisa Jane Trigg.
And Dr. Trigg, you have made for the Royal Commission a witness statement dated the 4th of June 2019.
That's right.
And the statement bears the code WIT.0156.0001.0001. Do you have a copy of your statement with you in the witness box?
I do.
Are there a couple of amendments, 3 in fact, that you wish to make?
Yes, please.
Is the first of those at paragraph 55, which can be found on page .0010.
Yes, there's an is in the first line that can be deleted.
So the first sentence, in Australia there is an emphasis, and then that next word is should be deleted.
Yes.
So the sentence will read, in Australia there's an emphasis on the ability of the baby boomer consumer to drive quality. That's how it should read, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
Okay. Is the next change in paragraph 124 on page .0022?
Yeah, that's right. The quotation should have a citation mark,
So
and it's citation number 1.
Sorry, the quotation that concludes, or at the end of paragraph 124, should have a footnote at the end of it, which is 1. Is that
That's
right?
right, yeah.
Okay. And finally, paragraph 146, which we can find on page .0026.
Yeah, so in the third line from the bottom,
Yes.
it should say reinforced by a lobbying system which is more professionalised than in England, not Australia.
So you would delete the word Australia and insert the word England.
That's right.
And the sentence should then read, this centralisation of the system in Australia has made it more susceptible to capture by provider organisations and by policy entrepreneurs, reinforced by a lobbying system which is more professionalised than in England.
That's right.
All
Thank
right.
you.
With those changes made, are the contents of your statement otherwise true and correct?
Yes.
All right. I tender the statement of Dr. Trigg dated the 4th of June 2019, Commissioners.
Yes, the witness statement of Lisa Jane Trigg dated the 4th of June 2019 will be Exhibit 5-40.
Commission pleases. Dr. Trigg, your current role is as Assistant Director of Research, Data and Intelligence at Social Care in Wales.
Social Care Wales.
Social
Yes.
Care Wales.
Yes.
And you've been in that role since February 2018.
That's right.
And what does Social Care Wales, what sort of an organisation is that?
Okay, it's, Social Care Wales is an organisation funded by Welsh Government, and we have 3 purposes. So one is to improve public confidence in the social care sector. So social care in the UK is aged care, but also care for children
Yes.
in Wales. So we have a remit to improve public confidence in the sector, to develop the workforce, and also to support quality improvement in the sector. So one of our key roles is actually registering care workers, which is quite different from Australia.
Yes.
So all care workers by 2022 in Wales will be registered, whether they work in residential care, community care with children or with adults.
All right. We might come back to that topic
Okay.
if we may. Just make a note of that. So just so that I can understand that, is it actually part of government or is it a private organisation that's funded by government?
No, it's part of government, government sponsored.
Right,
Yeah.
okay, thank you. You set out a bit more detail about it in paragraph 5 of your statement, which I don't need to take you to in any detail. Prior to holding that role, between 2011 and 2018, you worked as a researcher at the London School of Economics and Political Science, LSE.
That's right.
And you continue to be a visiting fellow at the LSE.
Yes.
I'll come in a moment to your research work that you did during that period, but significantly prior to that, earlier than that again, between 1989 and 2010, you worked in leadership, project management and consulting roles in customer relationship management projects and operations in England and Australia.
That's right.
Can you give us an example of one of those roles during that period? What sort of organisations were you working for?
Okay, so I did a variety of roles, consulting roles, managing operations myself. So I worked with companies like Telstra, Qantas, Aussie Home Loans, AMP. So, for example, at one point in my career, I was actually, and please don't hold this against me, I was managing Big Pond technical support for Australia. But I did other projects working with, for example, Westpac to how to improve the way they looked after their customers. So a variety of projects, a variety of sectors.
All right. I'm going to have to ask you to keep your voice up if you could, please.
Sorry.
Only because you're competing with a rather noisy bit of machinery to my left here, which is interfering. I should ask you about that. That seems a long way removed from aged care, or is it necessarily that far removed from aged care? Are there any synergies between that previous life and the area that you now work in?
Well, the reason I changed careers was that I wanted to do something that was, I guess, more in the public good.
Yes.
So I consciously changed sector and became involved in research. I suppose the thing that has struck me is the opportunity to take some of that learning and apply it to this sector. So I think that there are, certainly because the focus of my role before was around customers and relationships and customer loyalty, there are many parallels with how you try to manage operations to do those things.
Yes.
So some of the challenges are very different, but the importance of leadership and management and valuing staff. If you want to provide good customer service, good sales, they're also essential components. So I suppose one of the nice things is I had a bit of a unique opportunity to bring those skills and experience to looking at this sector.
As you say in your statement at paragraph 9, your recent qualifications include a PhD in social policy awarded by the LSE, and then various other prior academic qualifications which I won't trouble you with but are set out in paragraph 9. And you make the point that the witness statement you provided to us draws heavily on the research work that underlay that PhD thesis, and in fact the thesis itself. Is that right?
That's right.
And the thesis title is in paragraph 10 of your statement, Improving the Quality of Residential Care for Older People, a study of government approaches in England and Australia. That's the title of your thesis. And I want to ask you a little bit about that, particularly the research work that you did that led to the publication of the thesis. Firstly, the work involved research in both England and Australia. Is that
That's
correct?
Right. Yes.
And in broad terms, what were you researching? What were you trying to find out?
Okay, so in my previous career, I worked with a number of organisations in various different sectors, and many of them were regulated. So I worked in telecoms, financial services, and many of the organisations I worked with were trying to achieve accreditation around their quality. When I started at the LSE, I was doing research into quality in aged care in many different countries and looking at how particularly European countries regulated for quality. And it occurred to me that there was this very strange kind of philosophy, belief, that inspection was a way to improve quality. So that, whether announced, whether it's a day, whether it's 2 days, this idea that an inspector could go, or a reviewer in Australia, could go into an organisation, spend a day, 2 days, 5 days, whatever, and think that quality was going to be different for the other 360 days of the year. So It was this idea that regulation and inspection could make a significant difference to quality, which from my experience in other sectors was, I suspected, misguided. And at the time I was also reading some really good work by some academics at ANU who did some great work comparing England and Australia and the US in the early 90s. And it just became clear that there was an opportunity to look at this again. And obviously with my history in Australia, I was naturally drawn to comparing those two countries. And the systems were, on the surface anyway, quite similar. So it was a good opportunity to see whether there were any differences and what different that made to quality of care. So that's kind of where it emerged from.
Thank you. Can you summarise for us the research work that you actually did? How did you go about this research?
So for the period of my research, I spent time in both England and Australia.
Yes.
Interviewing different individuals and also going to visit care organisations. So in England, I interviewed 32 people. So in both countries, I interviewed people who were in the regulator, so here in the quality agency,
yes.
In the peak bodies. So I met with COTA, with LASA, with all of the peak bodies involved. Not all, but most of the peak bodies involved in care. I also talked to people in the Department of Health. I talked to people in the unions. I talked to consumer representatives. And the other thing I did while I was in Australia, I talked to slightly more people. I think I talked to 32 in England, 47 in Australia.
Yes.
I also identified 5 care organisations that I could go and talk to about. We'll come back to this, I suspect, but I tried to find 5 organisations that were delivering excellent care, so I could go and talk to them about what was it that makes them provide excellent care and what did regulation necessarily have to do with that. So I came to Australia in 2015 and 2016. I spent 5 months here in total.
Yes.
I was lucky enough to have a visiting position at ANU while I did it, and so yes, it's 47 interviews in Australia, and then an additional visit to care providers and interviews with those people as well.
All right. You mentioned the 5 care providers, and it might be an appropriate time to ask you about that. How did you identify 5 care providers that were providing excellent quality?
So it's really important to me to find 5 really good care providers. So
yes.
what I wanted to do is talk to them about you provide excellent care. Where do you get the inspiration for that? What makes you an organisation that excels in this sector? And I think one of the most striking things, and I mentioned this in my research, is the difficulty I had in finding out who delivers good care in Australia. So we've seen this week that there are excellent providers out there. There are excellent providers in England, there are excellent providers in Australia. But the difference was that in England there was enough information out there that I could make a rough assessment of who I could talk to. Flawed, not perfect information, but enough information to make some assessment of who I should go and talk to. The difficulty in Australia is that there was absolutely no way of finding out. So there's no information in the public domain. 98% of providers pass accreditation, so there's no differentiation between the people who just passed and the people who are excellent. So I was really stuck with identifying those good providers, and in fact what happened in my research is I found myself in I'm going to call them facilities, which is a word I'm very uncomfortable with. But
we might come back to that.
I think I thought you might. Facilities which were doing, great people working there and great intentions, but clearly hadn't grasped how to deliver good dementia care and good end-of-life care as well.
Did you speak to the department about, in your efforts to identify these 5 providers?
That's right.
Yeah. And what was the response from the department?
Well, I talked to the agency and the Department of Health at both the state level and the federal level, and one of the things that was striking is so there was some indication of who the really good people were, and there were, you know, some names that come out again and again when you talk about Australian care. What was interesting to me is that good quality seemed to be conflated with who were the best known CEOs. So and there was no correlation in the care that I saw with that profile in some providers. So I'm overcomplicating this, but essentially I was given the name of 5 providers, and within that was some really good care and some pretty ordinary care.
Thank you. And as you've already told us, as you say in your statement, you've distilled some of the key areas from your PhD thesis, slightly reduced the number of footnotes, and resulted in a very comprehensive witness statement for us.
Only slightly reduced the number of footnotes, sorry.
Now, in addition to the work that you've done, you've been in the hearing room for all 5 days of this hearing.
That's right.
You've sat through all of the evidence that has been led by the council team here in Perth.
Yes.
And you've also been following proceedings in the Royal Commission in the earlier hearings.
Yes, some of it.
Some of
yes.
it. No, I'm not suggesting you've watched all of it. Not in the middle of the night in Wales, but you've been following it. We have also provided you with some transcripts and some other documents that we've asked you to read before coming along to give your evidence here today.
That's right.
All right. Now, I want to ask you a bit about the hearing of this week, and the way I want to do that is to identify 3 troubling aspects of the evidence and 3 parts of the evidence that we could describe as uplifting stories that we've heard, and then I'll ask you some questions about that. So firstly, the troubling parts of the evidence. You were present in the hearing room when Nolene Heusler gave evidence on Monday of this week. And Ms Heusler told us about her experience of her 89-year-old father, who was assaulted 3 times in his bed in a residential aged care facility operated by one of the largest providers of aged care in Australia. And she also told us about what happened after she raised a complaint about the facility, and she was subjected to what appeared to be something of a David and Goliath battle with the management of that organisation. We heard yesterday from Shannon Ruddock, who gave very moving evidence about the circumstances surrounding her father, and she told the Commission that in his very final weeks she was wishing for him to die more quickly so that he didn't have to return to an aged care facility where he'd previously been residing. We also heard from Anna Irwin, an articulate and obviously intelligent young physiotherapist who described her experience working in aged care and didn't want to return to work in aged care, largely because of the role that she'd performed, which she saw as a rather perfunctory, pointless exercise of pain management, pain assessment and pain management. And she told us that it provided no opportunity to her to exercise her professional judgment, her training, which had taught her you can't take a one-size-fits-all to physiotherapy, and appeared to her to be driven by funding arrangements rather than the provision of quality care for recipients. Counterbalanced by some uplifting stories, some truly uplifting stories. We heard from EA, who spoke of the wonderful experience that she and her partner EB had being cared for by Alzheimer's Western Australia. And we also heard from Jason Burton, and we could see his obvious passion and joy really in the work that he does at Alzheimer's Western Australia. Secondly, we heard from Kevin Chester, who spoke so movingly about his wife Marie and the care that she received from Whitten and the way that he was embraced as part of her family. And we heard the carer, Ms Jubb, who told us about her role as a buddy for Marie Chester. And finally, we saw that terrific video that was played when the managers from Wintringham were giving evidence, and we saw the stories about the formerly homeless men and one woman, I think it was, who live and enjoy the warmth and the care that they get at Wintringham. And sometimes, first time in many years for them, they've had that sort of experience, that sort of human experience. I suppose the question that arises from all of that is, from the work you've done and your observations of the Australian aged care system, which provides us with a better guide overall about the system? Is the good more typical, or is it the bad that's more typical, do you think?
It's very difficult to say because, well, one of the challenges you have with judging the quality of care is how do you compare it? What information do you take? So it would be very difficult for me to say with any degree of certainty that one is better than the other. I suspect, well, certainly in England, you get some outstanding provision and some very, very poor provision. And then most provision is either good or requires improvement. So there's this big chunk in the middle,
yes.
Most of which is on the airs towards the good. I suppose the thing I would say about what I've observed in Australia, one is that good providers that were suggested to me didn't seem to be that good at all. So that was one issue, that it's hard to identify who they are. But some of the things that I saw in Australia surprised me. Maybe the most tangible example is that there are still people who share rooms. So I visited some providers where there were people sharing rooms, and that's something that hasn't happened in England for nearly 20 years. So in England and the rest of the UK, rooms are only shared if it's a cohabiting couple or a married couple, or if, for example, you might get, sisters who want to share, or best friends. So there are examples of things going on in Australia that I found quite surprising. When I arrived here, I had this idea, having lived here and loved living here, and having seen that 98% of providers pass accreditation, I had this idea that, oh my goodness, it's going to be so much better. And that wasn't my perception by the end of my stay. Like England, there's, we can talk about different types of quality later, but there seems to also been quite a big emphasis, driven by large amounts of money, to have very flashy residential care. So it looks fantastic, boutique hotel style.
Yes.
Chandeliers, tropical fruit, tropical flowers, fantastic. But those places feel like hotels. They don't feel like the places where people want to live the last few years of their lives.
Yeah.
So I couldn't say, it would be unfair to say that, care is much better in either place. We also have lots of problems with care quality in the UK, even though most care is acceptable or good. But certainly what I saw in Australia, I found I found it very disappointing. I came thinking, I'm going to find out how it should be done, and I didn't.
One of the challenges for this commission, which is hearing the good stories and the bad stories through each of its hearings, is to look at strategies, think about ways in which we can encourage more of the good and deter more of the bad. And I think some of the evidence that you'll shortly be giving goes to that. But just at a sort of high level, is that something that an aged care system can be designed to do?
Well, nobody's cracked it, so it's important to put that out there first.
Yes.
So you won't be able to go to a country and say, it's breezy here, let's do what they do. I think there are some important principles, though. Well, one is quality is not something owned by the Quality and Safety Commission. Providers own quality, and if they can't deliver quality, they shouldn't be trying. So, let's remember that whilst the government has a really, really important role here, providers have the responsibility to assure their own quality. So that, I think, is an important thing to say out front. Regulation can't solve everything, but what it can do is it can help to eradicate the really poor practice.
Yes.
So some of the things we've heard about this week, but equally it can help to shine a light on brilliant practice. So how do you inspire people
Yes.
to do things better? You have to show them how it's done. It doesn't come naturally to everybody, but what you can find is that you'll get providers who, given the information, can actually do wonderful things. I mean, we heard from, I think Patty talked about the butterfly model,
Yes.
which is a model of dementia care. It's a bit, in England we call it Marmite, so you either love it or hate it. So there are other models of dementia care. But, you could see how she had found this model and saw this way to improve quality. So there's definitely a role for regulators to shine a light on those wonderful bits of good practice. But the two other things I would say, one is if you're going to have a system that looks after quality, it needs to have many people involved. So the other thing I would say is the government doesn't own quality, providers do, but I also think it's unacceptable for us as a society, that's difficult, us as the public,
Yes.
to not support that. So some of the stories you've heard this week are about the best care being community focused, bringing people in. So it's not acceptable for us to sit and judge providers without being committed to helping them provide better care, because some of that is links to the community, is being involved with how those places, with the lives of homes, facilities. The other thing that's important is that whatever system is designed has to have checks and balances. It has to have lots of organisations involved. So, for example, in the UK, or I'll talk about England. So in Australia, you have this system where the federal government owns everything. So it's the source of policy in aged care, it approves providers, it funds providers, the Quality and Safety Commission sits underneath that.
Yes.
There's something called the Community Visitors Scheme, which is, I think, largely fallen into disrepair. There's the National Aged Care Advocacy Programme, but they all sit in central government, in
Yes.
federal government. What's important, and if you look at some of the really good regulation theory, is that you have multiple stakeholders involved in the oversight of quality. So I'll explain the English system very, very briefly,
Sure.
but it's not, as I was saying, it's not perfect, we haven't cracked it. But some of the things that are different are care in England has always been the responsibility of local authorities, so here it would be the town councils and the other local councils. And there are 152 of those, which makes it very, very fragmented. But we have, so within those local authorities, they purchase care for government-funded people. And our funding structure is quite different. I won't go there just yet. But we have, so the Department of Health creates policy. The CQC is an arm's length body, which the Care Quality Commission, which regulates quality. So it's part of the Department of Health, but arm's length. But then within local authorities, we have the bodies that buy care on behalf of people. We have organisations that are called Health Watch. So their job is to go and visit care homes and see how quality is going. So there's much more. And we also have very strong legislation around mental capacity and consent and depriving people of their liberty. And so all of these different bits of legislation and the different people involved, they all provide this kind of patchwork quilt
Yes.
of people who are caring about individuals in the care homes. So I think, as I say, nobody's cracked it, but there are some principles that could be adopted to stop this kind of single, huge monolithic body looking after care and everything associated with it, because it becomes very difficult to make challenging decisions. Because let's take an example, if the Safety and Quality Commission was to say, we're going to crack down on psychotropic medication, which is something you've heard about.
Yep.
Then the federal government also has to foot the bill for what might be needed to do that. So I think there are just tensions within that, the way that's organised, and not necessarily healthy, challenging, and checks and balances. So those are some of the big ticket items I would suggest. Can I just mention one more thing?
Of course.
It's about also something that I think we will get onto, about recognising the strength of different, let's call them incentives.
Yes.
So you may be saying to providers, we want you to do great relationship-centred care, but if the way they're paid is through the ACFI, which is really focused on clinical needs and activity-based payments, then you will end up with a poor provider delivering that. So just to be clear, good providers will deliver good care. You know, you've heard this week that they work around the ACFI, they'll work with what they've got, and they will find a way of delivering good care. But if you have providers that don't have either the competency or the values or the beliefs to do that, there are strong incentives in the Australian system that will dominate how they manage their organisations.
Excuse me a moment, there's something in your statement I think I need to take you to about that. Yes, paragraph 63 of your statement, if you have that handy.
Yeah.
It's on page .0012. Talking about relationship-centred quality, which we'll come to in a moment. But I just wanted to ask you about this paragraph, as you just made a reference to good providers will always provide good quality care. And I was just wondering about this paragraph and what you're getting at here with where you say nothing with the exception of inadequate funding actively stops good providers delivering relationship-centred quality. What are you getting at there, Dr. Trigg?
Okay, so clearly if a provider doesn't have enough money to employ staff,
Yes.
pay their rent, clearly you have to be adequately funded. What I'm saying is that the good providers will do this come hell or high water. One of the things that struck me is, so in my 15, 20 years of doing consulting, project management, we'd have lots of conversations about leadership being an art or a science, and which is it? And so there's a strong thing about there's a science to leadership and management, what you have to think about. The thing that strikes me is when you visit a really good provider, is you inevitably meet people and managers who genuinely like their residents and their staff. So, this goes against everything I've ever talked about when I've worked with companies like Westpac. Because we talk about, well, you don't need to like your staff, you just need to be able to manage them. But actually, when you go to really good providers, when you find a little beacon of excellence, almost inevitably it's run by somebody who just loves spending time with her staff, his or her, but it's often her staff, who comes in on their days, just goes the extra mile because they genuinely like the people in their home, whether they be staff or residents or relatives. So what I'm trying to get at there is that, those are people who will do this anyway, regardless of what what in academic terms we call perverse incentives. So, we had Anna earlier this week talk about the ACFI and how she can only administer TENS or therapeutic massage.
Yes.
Someone who's running a relationship-centred, good quality facility will find a way of doing the things they need to do within those budgets. So what I'm trying to get at is, the incentives in the system to deliver poor care exist, but the really good providers will do it come what may. It's just part of their DNA. That's what they do day in, day out.
Dr. Trigg, is there a bit of the evidence that jumped out at you during the week this week?
Well, poor or good, or I mean, what jumped out at me, two things. I'll give two examples. One is that there is excellent care in Australia, and there is plenty of inspiration here, I think, to remodel the system. I think, I was reflecting. I asked you to find the evidence from Andrew Sudholz from Chapara. I feel uncomfortable bringing this up. Sorry.
That's all right. We can bring it up. It was on the 25th of June, and it's transcript page 2391 at line 39.
So,
just a little context here. I'd asked Mr. Sudholz about a reference to Ms. Heusler as a person who was vexatious in some of the internal emails, and this was the response that he gave to that, if this is what you're referring to.
That's right.
Dr. Trigg.
So, it's unfortunate to identify a single person, but I thought that this quote absolutely encapsulated where you can go wrong in aged care. So can I read it out?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so this was him talking about the meetings that he went to, a meeting he went to at the facility. And he said, and on the I think it was mid-2016, we had a resident and relative meeting that I was attending. And in that meeting, there were a number of people who were very abusive, very aggressive towards me, shouted me down and showed little respect to me as the CEO of a big organisation. And I found that disappointing, and I was quite distraught about that. For me, that's the problem, that you're not the most important person in the room, and if you don't recognise that the most important people in a room are the residents and the relatives and the people who work with them every day, then you have completely missed the point. So I feel slightly uncomfortable picking an individual, but I think that really sums up what the issue is, that if you don't believe those people, not just the residents, but their families, the people who work there every day, whether it be in the kitchen or the laundry or, registered nurses, then you kind of miss the point.
So it brings us to a related point, or a directly related point, and that is the importance of organisational commitment or leadership to the provision of quality care in aged care. The Commission's heard a lot of evidence about this. Perhaps I could just bring up one bit of the evidence from this week. This is Mr. Marmarellis, the CEO of Widden, and it's at transcript page 2431 from the 25th of June. And it's at line 31, if that perhaps could be highlighted that passage. And you'll see that Mr. Marmarellis was being asked about Widden and its approach, and he said, quote at line 31, as CEO, I'm responsible for every aged care resident that we care for. I'm responsible for every home care client that we visit. I'm responsible for every retirement village resident as well. So as CEO, my focus and my leadership is really important in the organisation in setting the tone and setting the culture. As CEO, it has been really important given the cultural shift that we have to take to empower our people and give them licence to start thinking in this different context and to take them on that journey with us. It's probably a rather obvious point in light of what you've just said to us, but why is that sort of leadership and organisational commitment important, in your experience, in the delivery of quality aged care?
Yeah, it couldn't be more poles apart. So the thing about aged care, I worked in customer service and sales, managed operations. So something that is talked about for service and sales is the idea of emotional labour. So yes. There's this idea that, the people who are looking after customers through, whether it be through customer service or sales, they have this responsibility to put on a face. So no matter how they feel about the person on the other end of the phone or standing in front of them, they have to put on this very professional and warm and friendly face, and that is incredibly taxing if you don't really believe it.
Taxing on the worker.
Yeah. Imagine putting on your happy face. Yeah, you put on your happy face every day. So people have talked about the emotional labour in aged care, but actually people have gone much further, and I think this is really helpful, is that actually what we want in aged care is an Australian academic called this bounded emotionality. So what you want is people to be themselves. So this week we've heard about Tom Kitwood's idea of personhood.
Yes.
And something people forget about is that care workers also have that personhood. So to deliver really excellent relationship-centred care workers have to be more than just respected. They have to be valued and supported. As I think Jason said, I'm not sure it was Jason, but somebody said earlier in the week, if you try to lead an organisation where people care about the people they're caring for, they will also have really difficult times because people will die, people will move away, and they will find it very difficult. If you think about what it takes to lead an organisation which is full of people with their emotional hearts on their sleeves, but you're encouraging to develop relationships, to be compassionate, to care, to be reciprocal. So, the idea that there's a great thing that I'm sure you've heard in the commission, that you heard it this week, I know for sure, is this idea that you're not doing to, you're doing with.
Yes.
But actually somebody, and I wish I could remember who it was, suggested it's not about doing with, it's about being with. So when you're with people in aged care, it's not just about this one, this kind of supportive relationship. It's about a genuine, compassionate relationship. You have to be like Mr. Marma Ellis and understand that that's the sort of thing that you're supporting, and that supporting those people to deliver that sort of care is actually the lifeblood of aged care. So, yeah, I think that it's it's back to that point. You are not the most important person in the room. The people who are developing those relationships and supporting those relationships are absolutely the most important people in the room.
A couple of things. We saw in the evidence of Carol Jubb, who was the buddy for Marie Chester. She was only here for a short time, of course, but one could sense the genuine joy she got from those celebrations of Marie Chester's life. Was the resident of the week or resident of the month? Yeah. Ms. Hill will remind me. But that was the best week, Marie's best week. And you could sense the genuine joy. Is that sort of what you're talking about, that true relationship between them?
Absolutely. I would say, because I have been aware through other channels about the Wigan Group, and one of the things that I think is very admirable about what Wigan is doing is it's a large organisation that is trying to move towards a relationship-centred model. The best relationship-centred care I've seen is in very small providers because they feel like homes.
Yes.
They feel like places of joy. I remember one home that I walked into in England, you couldn't move for toddlers running around, and the manager's dog was pottering about, and there was any number of things, and then some ducklings appeared out of nowhere, and so it's just a place of, you could argue, chaos, but chaos in a very joyful and natural and enjoyable way. So Wigan have got some really nice ways of trying to bring that into their very large, well, not all very large, but they're big organisations.
Yeah.
So, with something like the Best Week, I think that the Best Week's a lovely idea, but what's really impressive about the Best Week thing is not the week that the resident has with the focus of attention on them. It's the fact that it means that they are known to the staff and to the other relatives and to the other residents as that individual. So it covers all sorts of information and details about that person's past, and so I wouldn't say everybody should do that, because one thing I would say, which I didn't, the temptation when trying to reform this system will be more projectitis. Okay, so wow, that's a great model. Let's take what Whitton does and let's roll it out with every provider. And what you just brought up in terms of what Mr. Marmarellis said is that it has to come from a leadership role. It's not something that you can instill into an organisation without that top-down commitment that this is actually the way to go. So yeah, that was a great example of a large organisation trying to move towards this a sense of a smaller kind of organisation.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you a little bit about terminology, because we've heard phrases bandied around during the week with different levels of enthusiasm for them. Person-centred care is the expression that's in our terms of reference, and you've introduced the notion of relationship-based care in your statement. What's the difference between those two notions?
I think it's arguably, the reason I've tried not to use the word person-centred, the reason why relationship-centred became, for me, more meaningful is that the expression person-centred has become so abused.
Yes.
So, you would get a care provider who may not be of an excellent standard, who would say, well, having in your care plan that you prefer tea to coffee is person-centred. Or that you prefer a bath or a shower, that's person-centred. And, people who are delivering really good person-centred care know that's not what it's all about. But the temptation is that if you give people choice, if you, write it down in their care plan, if you know a little bit about them, this could be, this is person-centred. What relationship-centred care, it builds on all those principles. So it's based on, like everything else that you'll have heard of, it's based on Tom Kitwood's work, it's based on personhood, it's based on individuality. But what it's trying to do is distinguish. I'm trying to distinguish between that bandied about term that people use so commonly without really understanding what it means, and emphasise how much that's about individuality, but it's also about relationships. So the best providers, and you'll have seen this in the evidence this week, are all about treating their provision. Don't even call it provision. They're talking about families and communities and people being involved. And one of the most heartbreaking stories I heard this week was that couple in Emma Caitlin mentioned. So she talked about the gentleman who was living in one part of the facility, and his wife was living, and I'll call it a secure dementia unit because I think that's what she called it, even though I struggle with that. And he just wanted to see his wife, and they couldn't make that happen. So he'd have an hour a day. That's not person-centred care. Relationships. So, having a relationship with that person, you would make every effort you could to make that happen, providing somebody made the good point that, the wife needed to want it too. Yes. But it's those sorts of things that people forget, the really important things, and helping those people, helping everybody in the facility or home have those sorts of relationships is really important.
I think Emma Murphy, it might have been the nurse who gave that evidence. Yes. If I could just tease that out a bit more. So much of the evidence the Commission's heard from people who are working day to day, especially personal care workers, and we heard from two of them this week, is that they're rushed off their feet. They don't have the time even to attend to the tasks that they have to, the basic tasks of assisting the residents for whom they're caring. And at the same time, you and others have said that relationships are of central importance, they're crucial, and of course we all know that it takes time to build relationships, you know, literally the ability to sit down and have a cup of tea for 10 minutes and have a chat about a person's family, if that's distracting the already overworked care worker from doing the tasks that their employer requires them to do as their indicators of their performance, is there a sense of unreality about what you're saying, if I can be direct, about people putting time into relationships? Is it feasible under our current arrangements in Australian aged care?
Okay, so I'll start with two things. One is we've seen people who are doing it.
Yes.
So you kind of think, well, there must be a way of doing it. The second thing is I haven't done a huge amount of analysis about how much money there is in the sector compared to England, so I would counter it with that. But what I would say is that, so if you work with, you know, a lot of people in our aged care system are living with dementia, and working with people with dementia can be very challenging, but it can be very challenging if you do it in the wrong way. Because if you do it in the wrong way, aged care facilities can be very unpleasant places to be. So I was trying to think of a way of explaining this. So in terms of how you work with people with dementia, so can I ask you a question? So I'm going to ask you a question. If you got on a plane and you were flying to London, it's a pretty nasty flight, it's hot and stuffy and, you know, not very pleasant. You've had something to eat and it was pretty ropey. The person next to you is fidgeting and it's really annoying. You put your little eye mask on, you stick your earplugs in, you finally drop off to sleep. Suddenly, the next thing you realise is someone has shoved a toothbrush in your mouth and is trying to brush your teeth. What would you do?
You probably wouldn't be too thrilled, Dr. Trigg.
You'd probably smack them in the face. I think I would. Or you try and get out of there pretty damn quickly. Or even worse, if they tried to take your pants off to change an incontinence pad. So you imagine if people are given that sort of care, just how unpleasant those places can be to work. Because you haven't, you know, imagine people kicking off in inverted commas. They're not kicking off, they're reacting in a normal human way to things that are going on to them. But you think about those places and what they like to work in. So you get less staff, they have less time to do, to provide good care, the place becomes more unpleasant, they leave. And then you're in this negative spiral where you're always trying to catch up, you're trying to employ expensive agency staff, you're recruiting and training new staff because they don't have the relationships with people. So I think in my thesis I give the example of, you know, if you have somebody in an aged care facility and to some people they'll know that Jenny, if you don't go to her straight when she rings her call bell, she'll have an accident, and that's what it is. To people who don't know her, she's just incontinent.
Yes.
So you imagine those sorts of places where you don't have the time to make relationships, you're just in a massive negative spiral. Because if you're not making the relationships, you're not providing good care, you don't know what good care looks like because you don't know the person. You leave, there's less staff, it gets worse. And without instilling good leadership and good practice, you will never get out of that spiral. You know, it will always be about, you know, rationing incontinence pads and trying to find agency staff and not being able to keep them. You've seen this week, I think what was very striking is when you asked the people who were here talking about excellent care just how long they've been with their providers. So, I mean, Brian Littman from Wintram, he'd been here since, I think, the end of in Wintram since the late 80s. Kate, who was with him, she'd been working in the organisation for 18 years. Patty and Gay had been, you know, working in the industry sector for many, many years. So you can see that there's a common thread there.
Yes.
It's about if you have the right leadership and conditions, then you certainly seem to be able to do it within the current funding structure. I couldn't, you know, I may be doing them a disservice. It may be very difficult for them, but funding is not the whole answer. You know, for me, so one of the things that comes up a lot in Australia is the idea of staffing ratios.
Yes.
So, there I know is a big move to try and convince that staffing ratios are the way forward. I would never argue that we don't need more staff in this sector, but for many of the reasons that I just explained, that if you make somewhere an unpleasant place to work, it will be, and you do by not providing the right sort of care, then there is a need for more staff, and there is a need to do something quickly, because there are clearly very, very poor systemic issues in the sector. But the thing I would say is that what we're not trying to do here is run hospitals. That's a low bar, because the idea that nursing ratios are important plays into that poor model of care. It's about, having more nurses, not about nurturing your staff and keeping them for longer. So whilst I can see that they may be appealing, none of the evidence says that having a very granular calculation about how you staff aged care, and you staff it, X number of hours per person, will deliver. You have to have a safe level of clinical care. Yes. So I'm not arguing about, it's all warm and fluffy and everybody running around hugging each other. Within that, people have very difficult, complex conditions in aged care, otherwise they wouldn't be there. They'll be living at home in their communities. So I'm not arguing that you don't have to have sufficient staff to look after their clinical needs. But if you want to get past that basic level of safety and you want really good care for older Australians, then that certainly isn't all about nursing ratios. So it's a chicken and egg thing. You have to create an environment people want to work in.
Yes.
And then they'll stay. And then it becomes a better environment to work in, and then they'll stay. And you saw that with Brian and Kate and all of the other people who've been doing this for many, many years.
I'll read you a quote from Kate Rice, because I was going to do this. This appears on page 2465 of the transcript on the 26th of June. She, of course, told us about being a manager at Wintringham. There's a few things about her evidence that I'd like to ask you about. This is at line 36 down the bottom of the page. She was asked some questions about recruitment, staffing, the points you've just been talking about. She said in the first line, I also look for people who might be interested in a pathway through aged care at Wintringham, because I think that's what we offer people too. I try and excite them about the job because I'm excited about working in aged care. I love it. So I think if I love it, I want to find other people who are equally excited as me. Yes. And then I asked Mr. Lippman about the same thing, and he described his amazing staff loyalty. And he said he reads in the papers about aged care providers struggling to keep staff or get them. And he went on the following page, and you'll remember he gave us those stats about how long his staff members had worked at Wintringham, doing no doubt pretty difficult work with challenging residents on occasions. And so my question is, is that just down to the role of individual management in a given organisation to make it a good and attractive place to work in aged care, or is there a role for the system? Is there a role for the regulator in relation to those matters, or is it more really for the sector, as you say, to make it attractive?
It's for the sector.
Yes.
But what we need is a system that supports it and doesn't sabotage it, doesn't put the wrong incentives in there to make money. So a couple of things. I've already mentioned the ACFI,
yes,
which will can, particularly in those really big providers who are really dependent on Commonwealth-funded clients, people, residents, for them, the ACFI just focuses on all the wrong things. Well, it focuses on all the wrong things, and it also has this issue that you can hit the target, hit all of the things the ACFI gets you to do, but completely miss the point about relationship-centred care. The other thing I would say is, and this is in both countries, is you have the huge incentive to attract large amounts of money here through the DAPs and the RADs, so the deposits and the daily accommodation payments. And if we go to the model of care, the model of quality that I tried to put together,
Yes.
what that also seems to incentivise is a focus on swanky, gorgeous, beautiful looking accommodation that appeals normally because often residents aren't making decisions for themselves. It appeals to relatives and let's, often you'll have families in situations where they feel terribly, terribly guilty about putting mum or dad or moving mum or dad into a home. And that decision seems so much easier if they're in a really, really nice looking place, even though the gorgeous, beautifully designed accommodation may not be in any way in line with that person's taste, but even worse, may not be in line with the needs of people living with complex conditions or dementia.
Yes.
So think about, some of these beautiful buildings that have these long corridors. Think about you're an older person who's lived in a house your whole time and you need support, and you just talked about Barney's evidence.
Yes.
Think about how do you design places that aren't like hospitals, that don't require call buttons, they have a sense of community. So, I think it's important to try to provide a system that doesn't sabotage things. And I'll come back to the thing that I said at the start, is you need to shine a light on good practice. And one of the things that was very difficult when I was in Australia, during my field work, so while I was doing my interviews, is I was really struck by the lack of appetite to say what good quality looked like. So wherever you go in the world, you'll ask people about quality in aged care, what is it? And it's really difficult because, people say, is it quality of care or is it quality of life? Arguably you can't split the two, because if you've got a pressure ulcer, your quality of life is going to be pretty awful. People talk about, well, it's different for everyone. One person will want to have wine with their meal, one person will want foxtail, one person will want something different. It's very subjective. People want different things. People want different things on different days. Today I want a curry, tomorrow I want a ham sandwich. It's not difficult, we're just human beings. So what I would ask people in both countries is, well, what do you mean by good quality? And I was very struck in Australia that people really resisted being pinned down, to the extent that I remember having a conversation right at the end of my research with somebody in government where I just got very frustrated and ended up saying something incredibly inappropriate like, Australia, have a word with yourself. You need to decide what this looks like. So people know what they can expect. So not my finest moment, I have to admit, but I was very, very frustrated with this idea that you can't put a nail in, you can't put a stake in the ground.
Yes.
And what I hope is that, having heard these wonderful stories about relationship-centred quality, that not just government but the public starts to understand what that looks like. Something that was very striking for me from this week is just thinking about Shannon Rudder and about Nolene Heusler. One thing that they had going for them, which just exacerbated their stress, but something that was very common between them was they knew what good care should look like.
Yes.
So if you look at Nolene's witness statement, when her dad first moved into the home that he was living in, he had brilliant care. She was so pleased. It was exactly where he needed to be. And then the care deteriorated after the home was bought. Same with Shannon. She knew what good care could look like. She cared for her mother in Calvary Hospital, and
yes.
she saw what it was like to have a good death. So she knew what it should look like. So she knew that when her dad, Vincent, was in hospital, that in the facility, he wasn't getting what he should be getting. But most people don't know that. They don't know what really good care looks like. They don't know that you can have something called a good death, that dying, can be a very, with all the stresses that go along with that, a very peaceful and spiritual experience. Most people don't see that. So one of the challenges, I think, as well, is to raise the expectations of the people working in the sector, the people who are using the services, the people who are families of the people using the services. But it's not acceptable not to say what really good care looks like. And I think that, for me, is one of the biggest takeouts from my research, is that there is something about, as I said, the system in England is flawed in many ways, but the idea that the person is at the centre of care and they have rights and they have capacity to, so the system in England, you have to assume that somebody has the capacity to consent unless you can prove otherwise. So you can't fill them with psychotropic medication. You can't do any number of things without flagging it. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, because bad things happen everywhere. But the system tries to work towards the point of, quality and care being about the person and about their rights and about doing what matters to them and the way they want to live the rest of their lives. So I think there is something about stating what it should look like, and even in the act of doing that, that's helpful for other parts of the public to understand what they should be looking for and to be excited about working in the sector. I mean, that's very different, isn't it, to some of the behaviour we saw with Nolene Heusler's father. Yeah, who would want that job? If you're just man-handling, person-handling, individuals day in, day out, what a thankless task, So let's assume that they're good people doing bad things, and that, the stress of the job and the pressures. Let's just assume that. But who would want to do that? But then when you listen to Carolyn, you listen to Kate, so people, who've been here talking about their care relationships, or Kate, the evidence that you just read out, those are lovely places to work, even under challenging circumstances. So I think, one thing that can be done is to say, what does it look like? What do you want the experience to be like for older Australians?
Yes. What I meant to raise with you a moment ago, I think this is where you were going with this, when you gave the example of the costs of staff turnover, for example. If it's not a pleasant place to work, people will leave, you'll have to engage agency staff, that'll cost you more, and so on. Is the point there that the provision of relationship-based care can actually ultimately save organisations money by retaining their staff, for example?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because if, Jason said this much more articulately than I can, but if you treat people like individuals and you work with them, and the example I just gave you on the airline,
yes,
the tap you gently on the shoulder, the tell you what I'm going to do, I know this is going to be uncomfortable, I'm going to help you do it. I think people underestimate, people lose their common sense. I think, you kind of assume, they've got dementia, they're different, they don't know what's going on. And I have a personal experience, so this is, the power of an anecdote, but my father passed away a couple of years ago in a hospital in Cardiff, and he had some issues, and I would sit with him overnight sometimes, not through the night, but just to help the nurses he had delirium, so I'd help them while they gave him antibiotics. And there was a gentleman in the bed next to him called Bob, who was living with the late stages of dementia. And so he was in the fetal position, he was largely uncommunicative. And I just used to see what difference good and bad care did. So there was one group of care assistants who would come in, and they would change his bed, and they would turn him over, and they would change his incontinence pad without saying a thing. And he would yell. He would do what you would have done on that plane when someone stuck a toothbrush. He would yell, and it would be unpleasant for him, unpleasant for the staff, woke the other patients up, so you've immediately got other things happening, and just created a whole load of work that didn't need to be done. And the reason I know this is because there was another crew that would come in and say, to someone who's not communicating verbally with you, they would say, Bob, we're going to change your bed, so what we'd like you to do is help us. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to turn you on your right to face the wall, and then we're going to take your incontinence pad off, and we're going to put another one on. Not a word. He would do all of that without a whimper. He wasn't really helping physically, but he was helping in his own way because he had been engaged with. So there was no more work. They finish their task, they walk away. You create chaos when you don't treat people in a respectful and engaged way. And I think that, the people who work best with people with dementia are the people who take the time to understand them. Can I give you another example? Sorry, I know we've got limited time. This is somebody I've worked with in the UK who's worked with a lot of people with dementia, and she trains care providers. And she had the example of a gentleman who would routinely strip in the care home living room. So he would just suddenly take his clothes off. And they had a woman there who had been raped. And so every time this happened, there was consternation among everybody there, but with one woman, it created really, really awful emotions for her. And so someone spent time with him, and they realised that every time he was going to strip, he'd say, diesel, diesel, diesel. And so they looked into this, and they found out that he had worked in the Merchant Navy, and that he thought his clothes were suddenly filthy and covered in diesel. So what they would do is every time he mentioned diesel, someone would say, let's go to your cabin, Mike, let's go to your cabin and let's change your clothes. And of course, as soon as they got out in the corridor, he would forget. He would forget what this diesel thing was about. And the crisis would be over. And the whole process of trying to get to know this guy meant that the environment for everybody was better. So I can't remember what your question was, Mr. Rosen.
No, that's all right. We were talking about quality and in particular the monetary savings that could flow for an organisation from adopting a genuinely relationship-based approach to the provision of care.
And I think those are two examples that just show you the difference between the chaos of not knowing how to support people versus if you apply some common sense and humanity and warmth, it becomes a much different challenge.
Stepping beyond the anecdotal.
Sorry.
No, but that's all right. I was wondering if there's any empirical work that you can point the Commission to that has tried to measure those sorts of savings and the application of a relationship-based approach in an aged care setting.
Yeah, there are some small-scale studies.
Yes.
But small studies that say, if you those sorts of cultures do encourage people to stay. I'm trying to think of specific ones.
You can come back to us on it.
Yeah, I think the important thing is that when you look at the research around, so for example, the question of staffing ratios.
Yes.
That actually the factors that make the difference are experience and low turnover.
Yes.
Okay, so I think, if you work your way backwards, the idea that you have a loyal workforce that is, consistently working with people rather than worrying about the ratio of nursing hours, there is much more compelling evidence about that model than there is about the quantity of staff.
Yes, yeah. Quality rather than
absolutely.
Numbers. Yeah. I'll ask you a little bit more about the definition of quality, because you've touched on this. In your statement, you talk about three types of quality. This is at paragraph 19 on page 3. You define three types of quality for residential care providers: organisation focused, consumer directed and relationship centred. Can you briefly explain what organisation focused quality is and whether you've seen any examples of that in Australia?
So yeah, absolutely. So the this model, because it's so difficult to define quality,
Yes.
what I was trying to do is think about, okay, if you're a provider organisation, how can we come up with a model which describes what your different focus might be? So I came up with these three types of quality, and it mirrors something another researcher has done, which I may come back to. So what organisation focused is about is this real focus on safety and quality of care. Now, you could argue that, it's really hard to define what quality of care is, because I would argue that if somebody is depressed and living with mental health issues and they're not being supported, that is poor quality of care. So it's not just about incontinence pads and avoiding pressure ulcers, it's about people's spiritual health as well. So I'm not, but mostly when I was talking about organisation-focused care, it's about patient safety, about standardisation,
Yes.
about filling in documentation, it's about being task-centred, focusing on the routine. But it's also about thinking about the person as a patient. So if you think back to that example I just gave you about the chap in the bed,
Yes.
Bob, then the organisation focused is do the task, don't worry too much about the individual that you're working with. Now you could argue that that's pretty poor anyway, but it is about the idea that the hospital-like nursing home, where the emphasis is just pretty much keeping people alive.
Yes.
If you think about some of the stories that you've heard. So the focus is on clinical governance, keeping people in inverted commas safe. But I'll give an example of that. You could argue the story that we heard yesterday. There were all sorts of issues with the quality of Vincent's care. But the fact that he'd had those falls, they weren't keeping him safe. And if you go back to the more important forms of quality, so one of the issues you've got with good quality in aged care is that you have to take risks. Okay, so if the quality of life of somebody living in your aged care facility, if they're able to, inverted commas, what people call wander,
Yes.
which I find an uncomfortable term, but if they're allowed to do the things they want to, they might fall. Okay, so you have to balance this idea that there may be a risk that they will fall, because you want them to have the freedom to do what they want, to sit where they'd like, to go out into the garden. What tends to happen with the organisation focus is that you want to avoid that.
Yes.
So you want to avoid the falls. So you fill people with psychotropic medication, or you put them in a bed with bed rails, or more insidious things like, okay, the chair doesn't have a restraint on it, but it's angled, so it's really hard to get out of. So organisation is all about minimising risk, it's about clinical governance, it's about standardisation, it's about safety, it's about warehousing. And a nice guy in Australia that I met, in a provider, he referred to something called the Triple H dilemma. Okay, so when you're designing an aged care facility, do you want it to be like a hospital because people are so sick? Do you want it to be like a hotel because people are, rich and you want them to come and stay in your hotel? Or do you make it like a home? So the organisation focus is really about hospital, clinical governance,
Yes.
keeping people safe.
Yeah, go on, sorry.
Would you like me to just talk about the other two?
Yeah, absolutely,
Okay.
please. Yes.
Okay, so that was the first one. organisation focus. So then there's two other ones. One is I call the second one consumer directed.
Yes. This
So-
is on page 5 of your statement, so that we know where we're going. Is that right? Should be consumer directed quality?
That's right.
Yes.
So what we have here is that care is a service
Yes.
that you purchase. You choose it. And I have... So a lot of the reform in Australia is focused on the idea that people can be consumers.
Yes. It's a language we see throughout a lot of the regulatory documents.
Absolutely.
Yes. Standards.
And I remember I had done, I can't remember how many interviews in both countries, and I did some, I was bored one day and I just ran my interview transcripts through a piece of software, and I was quite shocked by the fact that there had been one mention of a consumer in the English transcripts, and in the Australian transcripts I found 250. So that's the difference in perception of what this person is. So the second type of quality is this service, is the hotel-like accommodation. And really it's talking to people being empowered consumers.
Yes.
Okay, so, language, at the risk of sounding, I don't think it's pedantic, but one of the issues with calling people consumers is if you think about what a consumer really is, then these people aren't consumers for a variety of reasons. Just think about it. Think about Shannon Ruddock yesterday,
Yes.
who knew her father could get better care. But I think the word she uses, we were in a crisis situation, I couldn't do anything about it. And that for many people is how they choose an aged care facility. They've suddenly had a stroke or a health crisis, their spouse has died and there's no longer somebody to live with. So there are any number of reasons why when you are looking for this type of care, it is not a typical experience. But also there are other things. So, many people don't choose their own care anyway because they're too frail or they're living with dementia and don't have the I don't want to say skills, but that's not an easy process for them to negotiate. So if you think about the health status of individuals, think about the people who don't have Shannon advocating for them or Nolene advocating for them. You're 88, you've got dementia, you're living with dementia, you're doubly incontinent, you've had a stroke. How are you a consumer? You can't. Even if you wanted to move, you're too ill. You're even too ill to tell people. So you don't have the ability to complain. And if you do complain, you fear retribution. You fear, and everybody's been in this process, I'm sure, in health and aged care, where I'm not sure I liked how that worked, but you let it go. So there are some really unhelpful features of aged care that mean that it's not really about being a consumer.
Yes.
One of the things, what I said at the beginning about trying to find good providers, the information you need to process to work out what makes good provision could, if it was available, it can be very complicated. So, in no world is a pressure ulcer acceptable. But if you gave that information, so let's say, for example, you give people information on pressure ulcers, pressure sores, you don't know whether actually this is a brilliant facility who would just take the very sickest people, who come from hospital and had pressure ulcers. So the information there's the technical term is information asymmetry. The provider knows so much more than you do.
Yes.
You'll never uncover exactly what quality looks like. And I think one thing that's really important about this idea about public information, there's something very specific about aged care that is important. So if you think about somebody being a consumer, if you see, so aged care has different bits to it. So if you think about it in terms of goods and services, there's a bit of aged care which you could argue has something that someone's called search property. So you can look up on the internet, where is it? Does everybody have an ensuite bathroom? Can you have pets? There's stuff that you can see that you can search for.
Yes.
So you can see the basic information. But the problem with aged care is it's, as we all know, much more complicated than that. So there's another thing which isn't search, it's experience. You can only tell the quality of something after you've experienced it. So the perfect thing is a haircut. You can't go and say that's what I'm buying. Until you've been through the process, you don't know what that looks like. And or a meal in a restaurant, or flying with a certain airline. So in aged care, one of the problems you have is that you don't know what it's like to live there until you live there. So the way that regulators around the world are trying to help with that is so for example in England, the Care Quality Commission, when it publishes inspection reports, what it tries to do is describe what it's like to live there. Were there people in the kitchen chatting? So little things, but things that try to give you some flavour of what it's like to live there.
Would they descend to the level of what it smells like, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. We could smell warm bread. They knew we were coming. I'm joking. But I think, and anyone who's worked in aged care for any amount of time, you do know as soon as you walk in what sort of place you're in,
yes,
by the smell and the noise or the lack of. So that's one complicating factor. But the other complicating factor is this idea that health and care is complicated and is something called a credence good. Okay, so you might never know if you bought the right thing. And I'll give you an example. So if you go to a car mechanic and there's something wrong with your car, if you're like me, I know nothing about cars. If that mechanic says you need a new clutch, I will say, okay. I will never know if I did actually need a new clutch.
Yes.
You go to the emergency department and you've got a pain, they say it's your appendix, they take it out. You might never know if it had to come out. You are completely in the hands of the doctor or the nurses. And the thing that people forget about aged care, and you will have heard a lot about this week, is that a lot of it is about good dementia care and a lot of it is about good end-of-life care. And as I talked about with Shannon and Nolene, most people don't know what that should look like. Okay, so the idea of being a consumer and having control and having choice is completely undermined by the fact that you will never know whether that is the right place for you or your mum. So there are all these different aspects to the idea of consumer and aged care that I really struggle with. And also in this model, that's what we're grappling with. So what we're saying is that consumers are empowered and they can go and find things. And what that means in both countries is that aged care providers design their services to attract these wealthy consumers. So that's where you get the beautiful... and even to the extent that if you go into a really good aged care facility, they may say to you may say, I'd like to make muffins. I'd like to make muffins today, that's what I'd like to do. So you will go and make muffins. In this sort of consumer-directed world, there will be a 3 o'clock slot for you to go and cook fruitcake because that's on the schedule of activities.
Yes.
So it's all highly service kind of oriented. And one American author, I love this expression, referred to it as cruise ship living. So you're living in an environment where, you know, the cruise liner thing, you've got lovely accommodation, the captain's dinner, and you've got, all these other parts of the experience, but they're not real life. It's great for a week if you like that sort of thing, but they're not real life. It's not about living in a home. It's not about, it's 3 o'clock in the morning and I'd like to go and pick courgettes. Sorry, zucchini. I forgot where I was. It's about being very structured, about offering services. And also within that model, it's kind of weird because you're saying, well, the consumer is paramount, they have sovereignty, so they're more important than the care workers. So it's kind of a weird model. Whereas in the final model, the relationship-centred model, it's really about everybody being equal, everybody having their personhood respected and valued, and but also about the physical environment, about making it a home-like environment. And that can be very challenging in some of these big places, but I think the Widden guys have given an insight into how you might go about pursuing that. But care then becomes a relationship. So in the first model, it's a process, it's a set of tasks. In the second model, it's a service.
Yes.
People are paying for it. In the third one, it's a relationship. It's about being with people. It's two-way. And the other thing that's really important in that is the concept of a rights-based approach. That this person, no matter how frail they are, you always assume they have the capacity to consent to whatever's happening to them. And if you don't think they do, you have to work out with others what is in the best interest of that person. So if they don't have the capacity, and it's, I can't remember who said yesterday, I think, consent fluctuates, especially with people with mental health issues. You can have capacity to consent one day and not the other.
Yep.
But your presumed approach is that this is a person with rights and individuality, and you have relationships with them, and everything you do with them should be driven by their right as a human being to participate, to be supported, to make decisions.
Thank you very much. Now, we are, as you've noted, we are in a bit of time pressure today. So what I'd like to do to wrap up my questioning of you, subject to any questions the commissioners might have, is to give you the opportunity that we've given to others about a wish list, but with a particular slant, if I could, and that is, what do we need to do to move to a more relationship-based care approach where it's not happening in the Australian aged care system? So if you could sort of bear that in mind as a gloss, if you like, on the wish list that you might have for the commissioners.
Are you sure you want me to do this?
Well, it's too late now.
I'll make it quick. Okay, so I've talked about some of these. So, if I had your opportunity, I think is the right word. The first thing is set a vision for quality. Say what it looks like. Say, it's about relationships, it's about rights, it's about putting the person at the centre. Say what it looks like, so that people know what it looks like when it's there and what it looks like when it isn't. Something that is a personal thing, but I think many people in the sector would agree. Language matters. These are places where people live. They shouldn't be called facilities. They should be called homes. They shouldn't be called consumers. They should be called residents or people or individuals or citizens. But other things, abscond, wander, BPSD, these are people who are reacting to what's going on around them. So that sort of language matters. The floor, feeding, toileting. How would you feel if someone said they were going to toilet you, not help you to go to the bathroom? Palliating, all these words. The language matters and is essentially very ageist and very inhumane. Thirdly, clinical models won't deliver relationship-centred care. So think about how the structure of the ACFI, but also community care packages works. So, if you really believe in relationship-centred care with outcomes and what matters to the person, looking at their capabilities today of, you've had a stroke, this is what you get. What the care system needs to be structured around is what matters to that individual, what do they want to achieve, what do they need help with. So that is a really important point. Regulation won't fix everything, I've said that already. The Safety and Quality Commission doesn't deliver quality, providers do. The Quality and Safety Commission can help eradicate bad practice, but everybody, we need to design a system where those responsibilities are more embedded in the way people work and in the way they support their own communities. Three things also. One of the things that I've talked about while I'm here is, so I know that the ACFI has been noticed as being problematic for some time, and that there were 2 reports written about it, and both of those reports suggested a new activity-based model, rather than, okay, if good care, and we come back to the problem, you have to say what good care looks like. How does that in any way help you to deliver the sort of care that needs to be delivered? So I think there's something about thinking big and not tinkering, not necessarily to throw the baby out of the bathwater, but, think about new models of care, think about shifting away from these formal relationships, new models of ownership, think about shifting responsibility to local communities. Those are the people who know best what's going on in aged care facilities. So involve those people, involve residents, involve relatives in designing new models of care, in delivering new models of care, in overseeing quality, in supporting, the various things that need to be done to ensure people have their rights protected. And finally, you'll be pleased to know, so something that's very easy to do in these sorts of situations is go running around the world looking for the answer. And there are well publicised examples of things of services that people go. So, for example, in the Netherlands, everybody will go off to the De Hogways Dementia Village, and they'll also look at Birdsong, which is the self-managed teams. And they are brilliant initiatives, and they are worth going to see. But I think for me, the biggest thing I would want the Commission to remember is that the answers have been in this room. There are people in this room who know what you need to do. There are people in this room who have the answers, who've been doing this stuff for 10, 20 years. And I suppose my biggest wish is that those people become the most important people in the system, and they're the people who will guide your work in what this needs to look like.
Thank you, Dr. Trigg. Commissioners, that concludes my questions of Dr. Trigg.
Well, you very modestly didn't refer to yourself as one of the people in this room, but you certainly are, and the way you have drawn together the threads of the evidence we've heard this week and fitted it into an overview of good quality care has been enormously helpful to us, and in the course of the Commission we will be keeping up our conversation with you. Thank you very much for your evidence. The Commission will adjourn for 10 minutes.
All stand. The Royal Commission is adjourned.
Just get there, won't we?
Yes, Mr Rosen.
Commissioners, I propose on behalf of the Council Assisting Team to make some brief closing remarks. Commissioners, the hearing this week has been focused on person-centred care and palliative care. I'd like to close the hearing with a reflection on the key themes that we've seen emerge from the evidence this week. The key themes are: 1, how social attitudes inform the delivery of aged care; secondly, the importance of relationships in delivering person-centred care; and finally, the importance of organisational leadership. We heard during the week about the broader societal context in which the aged care system operates and the ways that that can affect the care that is provided. The Age Discrimination Commissioner, Dr Kate Patterson AO, told the Commission about what she called the scourge of elder abuse and ageism that we see in our community. These beliefs can lead to assumptions that a person is incapable of making decisions for themselves or does not want to pursue meaningful activity and personal growth. This can in turn lead to the balance between autonomy and protection being skewed so that older people's wishes are not respected. Dr Mike Runge of the Centre for Modern Ageing told the Royal Commission that these negative beliefs about older people can lead to complacency and a lack of innovation in aged care. He said you get positioned in a place where the world thinks it's okay to stick you in an aged care facility without trying really hard to see whether we could keep you at home with a package. And the world thinks it's all right for you to be doing nothing all day and bored, and that you ought to be able to cope with that. Ms Houston, a personal care worker, shared her experience of this to the Commission. She said, well, we'll just stick them over there where we can't see them, and we won't worry about that because it's all a bit yucky when people get old and, you know, they're just not themselves anymore. Dr Patterson emphasised the need for education to create a deep change in community attitudes towards older people. She made the point that the culture set by younger people now is the culture they will inherit. In our exploration of the concept of person-centred care, we heard throughout the week from a number of witnesses about what they see as the fundamental components of person-centred care. And some consistent themes have emerged from this evidence. We heard that good relationships and really knowing the person you're caring for are critical to providing care. Commissioners, you heard about the importance of respectful, trusting and authentic relationships between the person receiving care, their carers, the aged care providers and care staff. About how important it is for a person's family and friends to be involved in care decisions, as they have unique insights into the person concerned. Carolyn Jubb, a lifestyle and leisure officer with the Widden Group, explained relationship-based care as, quote, more about coming together as a family and being able to relate to each other as a friend rather than just a person that you have to care for. Kevin Chester's wife, Mari, has Carolyn Jubb as her buddy. Mr Chester described his impression of where the facility where his wife lives, the home itself is just, it's a terrific atmosphere, he said. The vibes there were there for us. It felt good, it felt friendly. It didn't take me long enough to get to know the admin staff, all the nursing staff, all the residents in the place. They all know me, he told us. I know all of them. That's the main reason why I wanted to be there. Kate Rice, a manager at Wintringham, who provides aged care to the formerly homeless, described the relationship of trust she built with the residents. She said, quote, that relationship with residents over a really long period of time has really stood us in good stead. I think because the people we look after actually know us and rely on us and trust that we will be looking after them. Dr Trigg just now referred to that in the context of relationship-centred care. And she talked about the negative spiral associated with not providing relationship-centred care. Important evidence about costs that can accrue to a provider that is not focusing on relationships in the provision of its care. Brian Lippman, the CEO of Wintringham, told the Commission that he actually didn't know what person-centred care was. He said he'd never heard of the expression until we asked him about it. But he was focusing on the substance rather than the label. He described the Wintringham approach to care as, quote, treating people how you'd like to be treated. Or put it a slightly different way, how you'd like your parent or your grandparent treated. And so it's a matter of getting to know the person and spending time with them, he told us. Ms Houston, a personal care worker, said that person-centred care for her involves working with people and their families to find the best ways to provide their care. So this is a whole, looking at a person as a whole, she said, not just they need to be in a room, they need to be washed and cleaned. We need to be actually filling their needs as human beings. And so much time happens where people are sitting alone in a room or even sitting in a community room where they don't have any interaction with one-on-one with people. And as a person working in dementia care, I find that really confronting and disturbing, she said, and I'd like to see that change. We also heard how important it is for staff to know the person receiving care well. The Commission was told that this process is facilitated by consistency of staffing to build familiarity and genuine relationships, another matter that Dr Trigg so eloquently referred to this morning. We heard about what it looks like when care relationships fail. On day one of the hearing, the Mitcham case study demonstrated for us to a devastating degree the awful consequences that can arise when relationships fail in aged care. The Commission heard evidence about the response of Japara, the provider, to Nolene Heusler's report of abuse of her father. That evidence raises serious concerns. It is open to you, Commissioners, to conclude based on that evidence that Japara management appeared to dedicate its staff time, including very senior managerial staff, to fueling what appears to be a battle with Ms Heusler. In doing so, crucially, it appeared to lose sight of Clarence, the person in care. The evidence suggests that Japara management to this day rejects any real suggestion that its organisation may have handled those matters differently or better. The CEO, Mr Sootholtz, referred to 100% occupancy as an apparent measure of quality of care and denied that there was any systemic problem within the organisation. He gave evidence that of the 298 mandatory reports made in the relevant period, the fact that fewer than 100 of them had been substantiated meant that there were no systemic issues. It was not a big number, he said. His report to the board regarding Mitcham reported on the 100% occupancy and described Nolene Heusler and her group as making ongoing complaints and being vexatious. Although he did accept full responsibility for the criminal activity that occurred in his facility, he denied that there was a culture of impunity at Mitcham. There was no reference in his evidence to the need for greater scrutiny of allegations at a board level or improved transparency of reporting of abuse to the board. The evidence suggested that Mr Sootholtz appears to leave it to be those matters to be managed at facility level. We consistently heard that leadership within an organisation is the key to providing person-centred care. Witnesses told the Royal Commission that person-centred care as a philosophy should start at the top and trickle down in the organisation. The CEO, Mr Marmarellis of Widden, told the Royal Commission that as CEO it's been really important to empower our people. I have to work closely with the board and I have to take the board on this journey with us, and that also involves good reporting structures, good governance around the way things are done. The way we do things. The Commission heard that recruiting the right staff, supporting them in their role and fostering the right culture is important for person-centred care. Jason Burton of Alzheimer's WA told the Royal Commission that at the heart of person-centred care is culture. It's the culture of the organisation, it's the culture of the leaders, it's the behaviour of the leaders in the organisation. Without that, he said, care staff will find it very difficult to actually implement person-centred care at the coalface. He told the Commission that if you do not attract and retain staff with the attributes that you're looking for to be able to deliver this care, then it's just not going to be possible. Mrs Whitford, a registered nurse who works as an aged care coordinator, described the difficulty she has with recruiting staff in a rural setting. The Commission, of course, heard evidence along those lines just last week in Broome, and these issues will continue to be explored by the Royal Commission. Brian Lippman of Wintringham described how joyful it is working and living at Wintringham. He made that point that while their buildings are spectacular, that's not the point. He said, I'm quite sure if we took over an institutional place, our staff would turn it into a home very quickly. Some evidence that Dr Trigg gave this morning is significant in that respect. She made the point that there are people who are able to do this now in the current system. It shouldn't be accepted as being impossible or even particularly difficult with the right people and the right approach. We heard about how creating this culture of person-centred care can have positive outcomes for staff as well as residents, and can lead to higher levels of job satisfaction and higher staff retention. The evidence demonstrated that the way that care is delivered, that is the manner, warmth and flexibility with which care is delivered, is important. The care should respect the person as an individual and treat them as a person, not just as a task to be completed. We heard that in a person-centred environment, we should look beyond a task-based tick-a-box focus and consider the experience of the person during the process when defining what successful care is. Jason Burton made the point that person-centred care is a philosophy of care, not a model of care, but the two are often confused, he told us. Commissioners will recall Ms EA, who told the Commission about how her partner EB was treated when she was receiving care here in Perth at Mary Chester House. She said, when you walk through the door of Mary Chester House 2 mornings a week, there were people all around saying, good morning EB, good morning EA. They took the care and the time to make eye contact with me and with EB, to show her into the room, offer her a coffee, point out photos to us of her participating in activities which had been pinned up on the walls. It's certainly difficult and time-consuming to give people a lot of one-on-one time when there are 12 to 14 clients at once and limited resources, she said. And just these small things and taking a minute or two to sit down and talk with someone is so important to most of us when we are needing reassurance in a world that is so complex and so confusing. Of course, she's referring there to the EB's experience of living with dementia. Mr O'Donnell, who gave evidence by video recording, described how he sees the task-based culture play out in the residential care facility where he lives. He told us that what the carers are tasked with, they each have a list. They have to toilet and shower and feed A, B or C residents as soon as possible in the morning, prior to breakfast and then soon after breakfast. And I'm saying, he told us, that I don't think it's enough just to do that, that doesn't meet the requirements of the residents. They need more than that. They need people that understand what they particularly want, those particular residents, and it's different probably for each one. Someone who has have some contact with them and has some understanding of what they require. We heard about the importance of people having choice and control in how they live and the care they receive. Commissioners will recall the evidence of Ms Irwin, physiotherapist, who told the Commission that when a person in aged care does not have that sense of choice in what you do throughout the day or what treatment that you're given, how can you expect to have any sense of independence or any improvement in quality of life? Commissioners will recall the evidence she gave about having to ask residents on more than one occasion whether they wanted particular treatment. Even when they'd already said they didn't, they had no cognitive impairment. She found it belittling and inappropriate. Dr Sinclair told the Commission about the importance of advanced care planning for facilitating person-centred care and choice and control, a message that was echoed by Dr Patterson. Dr Sinclair told the Commission that advanced care planning should be seen as planning for the rest of your life, not just the end of your life. He told the Commission about supported decision-making, which is a rights-based approach to decision-making that enables a person with a disability to make or communicate decisions about their personal or legal matters. Dr Sinclair spoke about the importance of providing tailored supports to help a person to exercise their legal capacity even as their cognition declines. The Commission heard evidence about how providers manage the balance between autonomy and safety and how it can be done in a way that prioritises dignity of risk and increases choice and control. Evidence was called from representatives of Wintringham, Widden and Alzheimer's WA, all of whom demonstrated that it is possible to allow for dignity of risk in a controlled and managed way. They are but 3 examples. There are, of course, others. Ms Murphy, a registered nurse, gave an example of where this had not been appropriately balanced. She spoke about a married couple living in the same residential aged care facility, both of whom have dementia. As she explained it, I quote, "Because of restrictive restraint policies in aged care, he, the husband, cannot reside in the same wing as her because he doesn't have the tendency to wander. So he'll come to the nurses and ask to be escorted to see her. He's allocated 1 hour twice a day to see his wife, and he'll come and ask us many times a day to come and see her. And often due to time constraints, we have to let him know that he's already seen her twice today he has to wait until tomorrow, or it's not his time yet. Or sometimes staff might be busy and you might only be able to see her once a day. Of course, Dr. Trigg referred to that evidence in the evidence that she gave this morning. We've heard that people working in the sector want a care environment that supports them to provide person-centred care, and we've heard that a task-focused approach runs counter to providing person-centred care. This was a message that came through very clearly with the workers' panel on Wednesday. Each of the workers spoke about their desire to deliver care that made lives better. Commissioners, we must consider how we can support the aged care workforce. Dr. Trigg talked about that today, about the importance of a valued and supported workforce. What Tom Kitwood, that you heard so much about, referred to as the caring organisation. The organisation caring for the staff, more likely to make it the case that the staff will care for the residents. Jason Burton put it this way. He said, practitioners will do their very best to be as person-centred as they can, but if they're working in a care culture and a care environment of their organisation that doesn't support it, it's extremely difficult to sustain it. He said, I think part of what we see in the high staff turnover we have in aged care is people just disenfranchised, where, we've heard some really, distressing case studies of where it's gone wrong. But the majority of people working in aged care generally, and especially in dementia care, are very caring, compassionate, inspirational, passionate people who want to do their best for their clients. And they're looking for care environments that will allow them to do that. So I think unless our culture is right, he said, as an organisation, the board support that culture in our policies and procedures, our decision making, our senior management and our leaders at the ground, and then our care staff actually with the hands-on role. If all of those pieces are not in place, then it's very hard to see the end outcome of person-centred care take place. This point was echoed in the experience of Mr O'Donnell. He said the residents themselves really want more in many cases, and the carers want, they're very keen young people, many of them from overseas. They come here, they're trying to do their best to interact with the various residents in a way that applies to that particular resident. And they get frustrated. If they can't do that, they feel they're not really doing what they should be there to do, which is to give care. And the residents themselves get frustrated. They're wandering up and down the corridor looking for someone to help them. Of course, Commissioners, you heard the evidence of Ms Irwin, which I took Dr Trigg to this morning, and one can't help but reflect on tragedy might be too strong a word, but it is very unfortunate that a young professional, motivated to exercise her professional skills, was so quickly disillusioned in aged care, and disillusioned because of structural arrangements within aged care to do with the ACFI. It's just very, very unfortunate that a sector that so needs young, keen, professional workers can so quickly disillusion one, as was the case with Ms Irwin. Providers with good person-centred models of care explain that although there are significant barriers, they are determined to provide person-centred care and make it work. Chris Marmarellis from Widden told the Commission that it is financially challenging for Widden to provide this type of care, but he said it works because they make it work. Wintringham gave evidence about the difficulty in providing person-centred care without the appropriate resourcing levels. The Commission also this week has heard evidence where Council have explored the provision of person-centred care in the context of palliative care. The Commission was told about the importance of palliative care in aged care being person-centred. You heard from Joshua Cohen, a nurse practitioner, very inspiring worker in this area, it must be said. He told the Commission that the most important aspects of appropriate palliative care in aged care is adapting the care to the individual and the family and keeping the resident at the centre of that care. And this was echoed by Dale Fisher, the CEO of Silverchain, who, when describing Silverchain's model of person-centred palliative care, said, and I quote, "Philosophically, we believe it's really important that we transfer the power and control of care to the person affected. And clearly the family as well are important in that definition." One can't help reflecting on the powerlessness that Shannon Ruddock expressed yesterday as a counterpoint to that. Dr Jane Fisher of Palliative Care Australia emphasised the importance of palliative care being needs-based, holistic and responsive to a person's psychosocial situation. Professor Tiemann of Flinders University expressed the view that we need to make sure that person-centredness permeates all planning at all levels, policy, service design, consumer engagement, planning and evaluation, and that will be the test of us actually being person-centred. We heard evidence suggesting an inability of residential aged care facilities to deliver quality palliative care with consistency or to support access to specialist palliative care when required. And the case study was a good example of some of those issues. Some of the possible explanations for this were advanced, including workforce issues such as a lack of suitably skilled staff in aged care facilities, and funding issues such as the narrow definition of end-of-life care within ACFI. Attention was also drawn to the challenges presented in managing the intersection between the health and aged care sectors and Commonwealth and state responsibility, which of course is a theme that we will be examining in further detail in later hearings. The Commission was told about the need to normalise dying in what Dr Raymond, a palliative care physician, described as our death-denying society. She said that expected deaths can be planned for in a proactive way that can increase both the quality of life and the quality of death. The expert panel of palliative care agreed with the importance of timely and regular advanced care planning conversations to guide treatment and care towards the end of life. Another example of person-centredness. The Alkira Gardens case study showed the desperate circumstances families can find themselves in when the system fails. At a time when families should be able to choose how they spend their final days with their loved ones, instead they must advocate for them. Commissioners, you'll recall the evidence of Ms Ruddock only yesterday, who described how she could not be satisfied that her father's palliative care needs were going to be met by Alkira Gardens. Ms Ruddock, in agonising detail, described the guilt she felt at hoping her father's health would deteriorate so that he wouldn't have to return to his aged care home. One need only contemplate that for a moment to appreciate the trauma that she went through. The Alkira Gardens case study, amongst other things, demonstrated the importance of relationships between providers, care recipients and their families. And that communication is critical to the success of relationships, the value of a trained workforce and the consequences of inadequate care. The Commission also received input from many witnesses about what needs to change in aged care. Some of those suggestions, from quite a long list that we've heard this week, included Mr Moore, who gave evidence about the experience of aged care for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders and the Institute of Urban Indigenous Health's wraparound model of care. He told the Commission that he'd like the Commission to recommend to COAG to refresh the closing the gap strategies to embed aged care targets. Ms Whitford, a registered nurse working as an aged care coordinator in regional South Australia, described the difficulty in organising alternative therapies and allied health for residents. Some of our resources are very limited, she said. Our staffing is minimal. We have a very small volunteer base. Even access to allied health or geriatricians is very difficult, the logistical concerns. And even often the inability to organise contracted alternative therapies to come in and assist because of the financial regulations. So, you know, she said, providing some people we've trialled before enjoy yoga, and I've had a local girl come in to provide this for them voluntarily, and they've actually really enjoyed it, but we haven't been able to have the funds to support this as an ongoing activity. Senator Cooney's submission, which I read out this morning, along with many submissions that we've received, and the suggestions of witnesses this week can inform the work of the Royal Commission. The Royal Commission will shortly adjourn today until the 8th of July 2019, when hearings will resume in Darwin, followed by hearings in Cairns. Briefly, the theme of the Darwin and Cairns hearings will be firstly aspects of care in residential home and flexible aged care programs, including access and availability, wound, medication and pain management, nutrition and hydration, continence care, mobility and social supports. Secondly, rural and regional issues. Thirdly, quality of life for people receiving aged care. The Future Hearing program continues the work of the Royal Commission around Australia. The Commission's attention will turn in the next few months to an examination of the necessary reforms to the current aged care system to address the systemic problems that have emerged in the evidence, including problems with regulatory oversight, sustainability and funding arrangements. The Commission is determined to hear as much evidence as it can to assist in meeting the requirements of its terms of reference and to design a better aged care system for Australia. To that end, we encourage the public to continue to engage with the Royal Commission to share their stories about the aged care system, both good and bad. Many of the witnesses that the public has heard from this week were identified on the basis of submissions that have been provided to the Royal Commission. Anyone can make a submission to the Commission by following the steps on our website which detail the various alternative ways. In closing this Perth hearing, Commissioners, Counsel Assisting will prepare written submissions within 7 days, proposing that the Commissioners make certain findings arising in the evidence on the 2 case studies. We propose the usual directions for written submissions be made, and a note that we have prepared which can be handed up. It has been provided to parties with leave to appear. In summary, we propose a timeline for written submissions where Counsel Assisting will provide written submissions within 7 days. The parties will have the right to respond to those within a further 7 days. I won't read out the detailed written submissions now. They follow a pattern which has been utilised in previous hearings, and the final directions will appear on the Commission's website. The only final matter I need to raise at this point is in the nature of a housekeeping matter. That is just to note that additional documents have been added to both the Mitcham and general tender bundles, and we raise this at this point for your assistance, Commissioners, and for the assistance of parties with leave to appear. That concludes our closing remarks, Commissioners.
Thank you, Mr Rosen. There will be directions given in the terms proposed by Counsel Assisting. I won't read them because, as you've already indicated, they are lengthy, but they will appear immediately on the Commission website and be available to all those to whom they apply. We are indebted to counsel, solicitors and support staff for all the hard work that has gone with a view to facilitating this week of hearings in Perth, and we're very conscious of the long hours that have stood behind the calling of the evidence that we have heard and which has been of great assistance to us. The Commission will adjourn until 9:45 a.m. on 8 July 2019 in Darwin.
All stand. The Royal Commission is now adjourned.